Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. In this episode, we're going to talk about a very important question in missions today. How can sending churches and mission agencies work well together? What are some of the important things that churches look for in an agency? And what are some of the things that agencies look for in a church? Today, we're going to welcome two experts to help us explore principles that will help churches and mission agencies partner effectively to share the gospel cross-culturally. Well, today on the podcast, we have a special situation because we have not one but two guests joining us. One of our guests is from a local church. His name is Chris. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. And the other gentleman is from a mission agency. Ken, you're out there?
Yes, I am here.
Excellent. Together, we are looking forward to talking about this very, very important relationship between sending churches, local churches, who are sending out workers, and the mission agency that serves in that relationship as well. So Chris is on the line with us from the United States, actually North Carolina. He serves as the international missions pastor at the Summit Church in Durham. And he has served overseas as a worker in the Middle East. And he has a heart now to see local churches trained and equipping and sending and supporting missionaries really well. He and his wife have 3 kids and have been married for 11 years. Chris, just as we introduce you, give us a quick overview of how Summit Church approaches missions.
Sure. When we look at international missions, we kind of have 3 main pillars or rocks that we can look at. First, we prioritize church planning. So no matter what the specifics of our people are doing on the ground, be it digging oil or digging water wells or teaching ESL classes, their broad goal is to plant churches. Our plumb line here is that the local church is God's plan A for working in the world. So no matter what they're doing or where they are, their ultimate goal is to see churches planted. The second one is that we want to see things be field driven. So whether it be a short-term trip or sending long-term, every decision that we made is filtered through asking ourselves, is this what we're doing? Is this driven from the field? Is this a request that's actually coming from the field that advances field strategy? And then the third is just this principle of having just a continual assessment and reevaluation of what we're doing. Are we actually doing and serving field missionaries the way that we hope that they are? And just constantly cycling through our decision processes and making sure we're serving in the way that we want to.
Excellent. We try and describe our organization, the one I serve with, as a learning organization. That's what I hear you saying. We're assessing, we're evaluating, and we're adjusting where it's appropriate.
Right. In order to accomplish that second task, right, and to make sure that things are field driven, we do have to be in a constant state of assessment and making sure that we're understanding the needs on the field correctly and actually meeting those needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, very glad to have you on the program today. And I've introduced Chris just in front to give a slight primacy in this conversation to the local church. On the podcast, we believe that the church is the primary stakeholder in global missions. It's not the only stakeholder, but the primary stakeholder. And so very glad to have local church represented this way. Now, I'll swing over Ken Massey, who, together with his wife Angela, serves now with South America Mission. We sometimes call it SAM. And their goal is to help catalyze gospel-centered church planting movements in Latin America. Ken and Angela have served in Costa Rica and Bolivia for several years before Ken came to serve as Director of Development in SAM in 2010. He and Angela also have 3 children. Ken, please tell us a little bit about South America Mission and about your personal experience now working with churches.
Yeah, so thanks, Mags, for asking that. South America Mission is what we refer to as a legacy mission organization or missionary society or community. the term legacy there really refers to, more than anything, our longevity. So God has been faithful to the people and the ministries of South American Mission for a long time, for more than a century. So in 2014, we actually celebrated a century of ministry. And so,
Praise the Lord.
so we mobilize people from local churches out into the world to participate in God's work of redeeming the world. And over our history, we've done that on the continent of South America, primarily within 5 countries of South America. So Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Brazil, and Paraguay. And while South America has been the primary context where we've had missionary presence, I'd say our influence and our reach and our scope is really Latin America wide. And we've really begun to kind of expand that scope and influence in recent years through collaborative partnerships with other organizations. So as far as my work engaging churches, as development director for South American Mission, I like to say that my work is primarily about fueling the ministries and missionaries of SAM with the resources that are necessary to do the work that God's called us to do. And so I get the chance to work with churches, yes, to mobilize their finances, but also to work with churches to help mobilize their people to come and work with Sam, go and see what God's doing with us, to go as part of teams. And so most of the time I work with churches as we're putting together church partnerships. Yes, it involves that investment of money in the work that God's doing, but also it's an investment in sending people as well.
Very good. Good introduction. Just as we get going into this conversation, I want to make 2 quick observations from our time just before we hit record. And that is that Ken and Chris are relatively new in their acquaintance. Sam has served together with Summit Church for a time, but this is a fairly new connection. These guys haven't known each other for too very long, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
And why I mention that is I want to encourage people that new relationships need to be established. The principles we're talking about today are not necessarily built over a long period of time, but they can come into healthy effect fairly quickly. The other thing is, these are principles that would be applicable to different sizes of churches and perhaps agencies as well. It happens that the Summit Church is very substantial in size, many thousands of people worshiping on a Sunday and many campuses. But we're going to try and draw out principles that will be healthy when any local body of Christ works with an agency to send workers to reach the unreached. So, Ken, I'm going to begin with you as we talk about churches and mission agencies working together. How have the Summit Church and SAM worked together over the years?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is true, I'd say, with a lot of our church partnerships. Often these relationships with local churches begin as people from within those congregations come to the church and say, hey, I feel like God's calling me to go out into the world and be a part of Great Commission ministry. And so those churches then will connect those people to South American Mission. So in the case of the Summit Church, there are actually 2 or 3 individuals from the Summit congregation over the years who have gone out to be missionaries, and they have done that through South American Mission. So that's how we originated, if you will, the relationship with Summit. They're also proximally close to us, just a few hours up the road, so we get to go and be there and be present. But as we've gotten to know them better, we've invited their staff, for example. One of the pastors of one of their campuses has actually gone to South America and was the primary speaker at one of our field conferences. So we like to engage the church at multiple levels. But then also a few years ago, as Summit really began a push to get more and more of their congregants, exposed to God's work in the world, they and other churches too realized that, it's a lot easier for us to mobilize people, to send people to Latin America than it is to the 1040 window. So practically it's just easier to get our people exposure. So Summit came to us and said, hey, what would it look like for us to begin to partner together in a strategic way? But also, what does it look like for us to send our people to SAM and have our people plugged into your ministries in a way that helps you accomplish your purposes, but also gives our people exposure to God's work in the world?
I'm seeing it as there are a lot of different doorways through which a relationship between a church and an agency can be initiated. You've mentioned a couple of them. And then there's the opportunity to grow it up and becomes multifaceted over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can jump in, I will say from the sending church's perspective, it's always helpful when you can do both short-term and long-term sending simultaneously, or at least consistently to the same organization or even the same place. And so in this case, we sent long-term missionaries, which we define as 2 years or more, long-term missionaries to serve alongside or with Sam, but then sent short-term teams to join in that work there for 1 or 2 weeks at a time. It doesn't necessarily have to work that way. So if one of your listeners are, part of a missions committee or pastor at a church, really looking at using short-term trips to eventually build to long-term relationships with sending organizations, but also long-term sending. So just looking at, hey, using these 1 or 2 week trips, not as a goal in and of themselves, but praying that the Lord would raise people out of those trips to go back with Sam, for instance, long term.
Absolutely.
That's great. Long-term and short-term woven together. Pastor Chris, there are some things that a church like the Summit Church or any church will look for in an agency as you consider partnering with them. What are some of the foundations that you look for to be in place and say, this is an agency with whom we really could lean into the Great Commission?
Sure. There are three main ones as I think through it. One is just true with any partnerships that churches have, and that's just theological fidelity, right? You want to work with people that understand the Bible, Christ, his church, and the gospel the same as you do and the same as your congregation does. But beyond that, there are two really specific ones that, to be honest, are really honestly very unique to international sending. One is we're looking for organizations that have missional expertise. We at the Summit Church are really good, or we strive to be really good at reaching Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. People in the congregation and me as a pastor here, we don't have a lot of operational knowledge on Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and Paraguay, just for example. And so we're looking for an organization when we have people raised up out of our congregation that express a desire to serve in Central America, for instance, or in South America. We are looking for organizations like SAM that bring that expertise to these areas. So, I think you can get into dangerous waters when the sending church tries to be too much of an expert on engaging cross-culturally, engaging on the other side of the world. Yes, you want to make sure that the sending church is putting in theological parameters or requiring a certain understanding between the sending church and that receiving organization for your people. But beyond that, when it gets just down into the weeds of contextualization, assuming that they are being biblically faithful and theologically sound, you're relying on them to do the hard work of contextualizing the gospel to that location. The second thing that I think is unique when we talk about international work is just accountability. We're looking for an organization that will be the eyes and ears of the congregation on the ground. What I mean by that is, as we send missionaries to other countries, we do our level best to still be pastors to them, to still be their sending church. And, that means calling them on a weekly or monthly basis. It means reading their newsletters, still kind of holding the rope for them. But there's only so much that we can do not being actually there with them. So we're looking for sending organizations that will, make sure that they are being spiritually and emotionally cared for on the ground in China or in Bolivia or in Paraguay. We're also looking for accountability in terms of, are the missionaries that we are sending out, are they doing what we have commissioned them to do? So when you're looking for sending organizations, you're looking for ones that agree to covenant with you, covenant with the congregation, to receive your people well, care for them emotionally, pastorally even, but also care for them in terms of just keeping them accountable to the task. It's really easy when we talk about international missions. It's really easy to find yourself in a ditch, meaning, you're trying to accomplish a task. There are lots of ways to get sidetracked and to sort of find yourself going way off track. Sending organizations help keep your people on track with what the Lord has called them to do.
It's super. Theological fidelity, missional or specific cross-cultural expertise in a context, and then accountability and support of the missionaries' three key principles the church looks for. Ken, if we ask the same question from the agency side, what are some of the things that Sam looks for when you're preparing to cooperate with a church and work together in missions?
I think my answers will dovetail nicely with Chris's, but one of the things I'll say first is, we love it when churches come to us and they ask us, what are Sam's organizational purposes? What's your vision? What's your mission? What are the strategic ways that you're engaged in ministry in South America, to build for God's kingdom? And then they respond by saying, okay, we want to help you guys go further faster in those areas. So as we begin to think about strategic ways of engagement, the church is actually thinking, we're going to mobilize people, not just to send people, but actually get our people engaged in helping South America Mission accomplish its purposes. We love to see that strategic alignment. I'll also say, and this is something that takes time to build. I mean, we need to work hard, the mission agency and the church, to foster this trust and confidence. But we love to see the church lean on us for cross-cultural expertise. And that's something that Chris said that they look for in the mission agency. So a willingness to let us leverage that cross-cultural expertise is important. I'll say this too, South America Mission is not the sender of missionaries. The church is the sender of missionaries. And so we still look to the church as the sender. Nonetheless, we see the church as a tandem partner with us, with South America Mission, in providing the spiritual oversight and ministry direction and casting vision for ministry. I'll also say that we look for a commitment to mutual edification, training, and development of the missionaries that are coming out of the church. And we love to be invited into the church, to work alongside the church, to provide training, for example, that's necessary. Lastly, and we love this, and Summit Church did this with Sam before we started a partnership. They said, hey, can we go to South America? Can we go meet some of your people? Can we go to, in fact, it was Lima, Peru, and it was Bogota, Colombia. And we took a couple guys on staff from Summit Church down to meet some of our key people, to see how God was working, which was really about the Summit Church getting a vision for engaging Sam and sending their people to South America to work with Sam. So we love it when churches are like, hey, we want to go, and they express an interest in understanding who we are in our ministry context better.
Well, these are great principles to undergird the conversation, some starting points or progress points for the conversation between a church, maybe your church, and an agency. In a moment, I'm going to ask both Chris and Ken to describe how some of those principles are worked out as they do it together. We want to move from the theory to some of the realities of that. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
For South America Mission, it's simple. Let the church be the church. For over a century, South America Mission has supported the local church in its effort to embody the kingdom of God and offer others the redemptive hope of the gospel. Join our effort through local leadership and discipleship-based ministry to help the local church flourish and demonstrate God's love and mercy to His people in South America. Visit southamericamission.org to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we are back with Pastor Chris from the Summit Church and Ken Massey from South America Mission, Sam, and we're talking about how churches and agencies can work well together in global missions. This part of the discussion, guys, I want to kind of pose to both of you as we talk about these principles. As you begin to enact these things together, how important is it to actually get in the same room and to have physical, personal presence with each other as you work?
It's of paramount importance. It is probably the most important aspect of partnership, is being in the same room together, being present together, being human beings together, members of the body of Christ together. That's where the joy of partnership comes, and that's where trust is built. There's a phrase that I've always used, or tried to use. I've aspired to use this. It's a phrase that another successful development director shared with me years ago. He said, you know what? You need to be there and be available. Be there, be present, be with each other, and just make yourself available to each other. And so I think if we let that be our guiding principle, then everything else is just going to kind of fall naturally.
Okay.
I would just add to that. I think there could be a perception with our listeners who are saying, "Hey, they're both in North Carolina, and it's easier for them to do that." I would actually say it doesn't really matter where you are in terms of where Sam is, for instance, and where we're located here in the States, but making sure that Ken mentioned it earlier, making sure that someone from the sending church, be it a pastor, a lay leader, somebody, is willing and able to go and see the work that they're doing on the ground. So even if someone from the sending church and someone from the sending organization aren't able to sync up here domestically, at least having a relationship on the field and being able to begin building that relationship there, I think is pretty critical for a long-term relationship, at least.
I'm going to drill just a little bit into this and say, you guys are in range. You can drive to each other's offices. Does that mean, Ken, that you'll go up and you spend a day or a weekend what might that look like? Give us just an example of a practical outcome.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has meant that I'll, leave here, early one morning and drive up and go out to lunch with folks on staff at the Summit Church and just have a working meeting and then maybe go back to the church and spend an hour or two in the office there to talk about whatever we need to talk about. And then I'll drive back home, at the end of the day. It has also meant that especially some of the missionaries who, work in South America, who Summit has sent teams to and gotten exposure to, who might come here to the States for a time on, what we call a home ministry assignment. When those missionaries come here, and often they're actually kind of based here in our area for a period of time, they'll actually go to Summit Church and spend a weekend there in the home of a family that they've met, go and share at different small groups at the Summit Church. So, that's just a little flavor of what kind of being there and being present together has looked like for us.
Yep. A couple of great ideas there. Chris, I want to change the question for you a little bit. What if you can't do that in person? What if it's somebody from Colorado or Saskatchewan?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing, we're blessed with living in the time and era that we are. I mean, you have Fortune 500 companies that operate remotely, where you have hundreds of employees that are interacting with each other every day, and they aren't local. And so my experience with sending organizations, at least sending organizations like Sam and others that you would actually want to partner with, are very receptive to email and Skype and FaceTime, and really just being very responsive to be able to build relationships via the internet. The second thing is what I said before is just, if you can't go by the offices of the sending organization, that's normal. I mean, that would be 99% of the people listening to this podcast wouldn't be able to do that. And that's totally fine. But making sure that if you're going to be sending a long-term missionary to a place or to an organization, or begin sending, multiple short-term trips over several years to an organization, making sure that someone either on the church staff or a layperson is willing to go and, meet the people on the ground and actually see the work that they're doing and building it that way. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, face to face, where you actually, live, but it can at least be being deliberate with building relationships through taking trips yourself.
Just a couple of weeks ago, I was traveling in Western Canada and had a chance to visit at a church who's sending out one of their own family, a young couple from their church that's grown up in the church, sending them out. And that was the opportunity, actually, in their context, to meet with the missions committee and with the board of elders. We had pizza together, and they asked all kinds of questions about Send. Send is a newer organization to them. And we also articulated in our documents who they were going to have as primary contacts within the organizations, both ways. So that Pastor Dan is his name. Pastor Dan knew if anything comes up with regard to this whole situation, he knows somebody to call. He knows them by name. He's met them. And it's not like just calling the front desk and saying, "Hi, I'm calling to make an inquiry about our missionary." He knows who to call.
Yeah.
And there's already context there. And similarly, we know in the church as an agency, who do we call? We don't just call the church office and speak to the secretary. We're glad to do that too, but we know who to touch base with. And that's not that hard of a principle to set up, I think, even over distance.
That's right. And that's important to establish in the very beginning too.
Let's talk about training, guys. Pastor Chris, I'll go your way first. What are some of the principles that you follow as you're putting training of your workers in place with Sam?
Right. First and foremost, we tell our people to be teachable. When you are hitting the ground, you are new. You don't even know what you don't know at that point. And so when we're trying to prepare them to be sent out, that's the first thing that we want to instill is just to be teachable, be good listeners. The second thing would be to be a good servant, to serve the team well, to serve the other missionaries that you're working with well, also to serve national churches well. We want to make sure that the brothers and sisters that we're working with in China, in Peru, in Colombia, feel like we are coming to serve them, not dictate things to them. And so those are the two primary ones. I mean, we obviously, when you're assessing people to go out, you're making sure that they have a good understanding of the gospel and of scripture. But usually that's covered for the most part in the assessment process. And once we feel like, okay, they do understand scripture and the gospel and theology enough that they're ready to be sent out, when we begin training on their international context, those are the two main ones that we hit on.
That's good. Over to you, Ken.
Regarding training, I would say for us, one of the things that we really focus on and emphasize, especially on the front end, is cross-cultural training, especially when you're sending North Americans to another cultural context. It's just important to understand that the world that you're entering into is not better or worse than yours, but it's different. And there might be things that they value differently than we value. There's a different sort of rules of engagement in other cultures. And we need to make sure that we go prepared and equipped to respectfully and appropriately engage the other cultures. So, there's tools that we use when we train. There's one little book that's wonderful. It's called Foreign to Familiar by Sarah Lanier, which is a wonderful little primer for beginning to equip people to go and be and engage in a different cultural context. So I would say in our training, we really emphasize the cross-cultural.
That's bringing the particular expertise. And we will include that book mention in the show notes as well. Ken, I'm going to continue with you for a couple more of these, or at least the next principle here, feedback loops between the agency and the sending church. What are the principles that Sam uses to establish the feedback loops?
Well, when I talk about being there and being available, part of being available is being willing to give good feedback, to share intel, to share information, to do good and thorough debriefs, if you will. This concept of debriefing with the church and with the people after they go, even with long-term missionaries when they come home, working with the church to debrief with the church and the missionary about what they just experienced during their 2 or 4 year term on the field is important. And it's one of those things that I think it gets neglected, so there's a lot of emphasis placed on training up front, getting ready to go, getting equipped to go. And then, when we come back, we just kind of drop the ball often on the debrief, unpacking together. What did you see? How did you see God moving? How did you see God working? Do you have questions about what you saw? How is God calling you to respond now that you're back? That's very important. I don't think a lot of churches and mission agencies really do that well or give that debrief enough emphasis.
Okay. There's a tone of concern there that we're maybe not doing as well as we should. Chris, anything you'd add from the church's point of view, the feedback loop between the church and the agency?
I think I would just reiterate what we had already mentioned a little bit before now. We just fostering a relationship with a specific person in the sending organization. When you need something or you have a specific concern, that you know who to talk to, that it isn't calling a switchboard operator at the sending organization's headquarters, but it's actually someone that you've met with, that you have emailed back and forth with, that you have their phone number. I think it's just important to keep the conversation open. When we talk about sending people internationally, it can get really complicated. We're sending people to the other side of the world, various contexts, the amount of things that come up, be it illness, specific needs that the missionary may have, questions that you may have of the missionary or of their team leader, for instance. With the diverse array of places that a church could be sending to, it's almost impossible to anticipate exactly what your question is or exactly what problems could arise. And so actually having a relationship with one key person in the sending organization goes really, really far because you can just be adaptable. You and the sending organization can be adaptable to, basically work alongside or walk alongside of the missionary better.
Yeah. Mags, if I could, I'll interject something right here too regarding feedback. And again, you can do this well if you've put the time in on the front end to build the trust and confidence and comfort between the church and the mission agency. But when we're talking about feedback, we want the good and the bad. And I can tell you with Chris's predecessor, after multiple times where missionaries from Summit had come back, when we would have debriefs or conversations, we would talk about the good and the bad, when we felt comfortable being honest with each other. And so that's important too, to make sure that we're getting both sides of the issues.
Well, it seems to me that's a healthy sign of a relationship that does have trust, right? When you can go to those places that you really need to. And it's not all going to be sunshine. We've got learning to do. And
yeah. And it's really all in the spirit of caring well for people, but also in the spirit of wanting to get better, so.
Pastor Chris, I'm going to toss this one your way first. You talked about the assessment of the field need and continually assessing that. What are the principles that you as a church look for as you cooperate with SAM or with other agencies too, assessing the field need?
Yeah, honestly, to get really specific, every December, we will send out both to our long-term missionaries and where appropriate, sending organizations that we're sending them to and ask them, hey, what has gone well over the last year and how can we walk alongside of you better next year? And so for our missionaries that we've commissioned out from our congregation, it's asking them how their ministry is going. And then if there are any questions or red flags or things that they're expressing, stress about, then we actually know how to walk alongside of them better. And then with sending organizations, be it working with them to send short-term teams or long-term missionaries, making sure that if we have a short-term team scheduled to go see them, or we're raising up a long-term missionary to actually go to them, making sure that we're having that conversation before we actually get to the scheduling phase. So sometimes it's really easy to, just to get really specific, it's really easy sometimes to say, hey, I've got 10 people that want to go to Peru in October. I'm going to call Ken up and just tell him, hey, can you host 10 people in Peru in October? That is the opposite of what should be taking place. What we want to do is go to the sending organization or to one of our field missionaries and say, hey, we may have some people that have some capacity to come and take a trip to you this year. When would be helpful for us to come? What would be helpful for us to do? And so asking those questions, being receptive, and we try to do that on an annual basis, so we kind of project out for the next year.
Wow, way better, right, Ken?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for saying that, Chris, because that's so important.
Well, all of these principles are being enacted over time, and it's going to be helpful. We can talk all day about these ideas, but it's going to be helpful at some point to write some of it down. We've talked a little bit in preparation here about MOUs, memorandums of understanding, or sometimes they might be called contracts, but written agreements. And I'm going to ask you both to comment on these things. Do you use written agreements? And what role do you find them playing? Where are they helpful? And just comment on that. Chris, why don't we go your way first?
Yeah, we do have MOUs set in place between ourselves and sending organizations. I think when you first hear sort of that type of language housed around missions, I can understand if some people sort of are, have a negative reaction to that because it almost sounds too legalistic or corporate. I'll just say Ken and I are 3 hours apart. We're not in daily communication with each other. We don't go to church together. And so for our organization or our church to work with his organization, it's just helpful to have clear expectations. And one way to do that is to have it written down. Now, maybe it's unfortunate if you could reword it instead of an MOU, it's a covenant or something that has less legal language to it. But at the end of the day, it's just a formal agreement between the church and sending organization where everything is in writing and there's no chance for confusion or worry between either party of like, okay, who is supposed to be doing what? It genuinely is a complicated endeavor to send a member from the Summit Church through South American Mission to go live and serve in Bolivia. It's an amazing thing that we can do that. But in order to do that well, and honestly, to serve the missionary and our national brothers and sisters well, Ken and I need to make sure that we're syncing up in a deliberate way.
Yeah, it's very good. Ken, you want to add to this?
I think Chris said it well. MOUs, more than anything, it's an opportunity to articulate what our mutual commitments to each other are. It's a chance for the Summit Church to say, hey, these are our priorities as we engage in the Great Commission. For Sam to say, these are our priorities as we engage in Great Commission work in South America, to find alignment, between the two, and to get those in writing, to kind of, set the tone of our partnership. This is what we hope to accomplish together. And again, another thing that people run away from in Christian ministry are metrics, right? But it's good in an agreement like this or in a document like this to write down, hey, these are some of our goals, And so at the end of the year, when we sit down together and have a partnership review with Summit Church, we can look and say, hey, what are some of the goals that we set in the MOU? And did we get closer to achieving those goals? And so it's good to have some metrics too, for us to gauge the progress of the partnership. So
it's good. Well, I just see it as a way to clarify expectations. You're working with clarity, and it gives something concrete on which to build reflection and planning. We have found in setting up what we call church partnership agreements with churches between Send and the church and the missionary family. We have 3 parties in our documents, that it really raises early on some of the questions we would not necessarily have thought of. We've had churches say that to us, oh, we wouldn't have thought of that. And this raised it, and we can discuss it and then decide what's appropriate. So just as we finish on this, and we'll need to wrap up here somewhere, so we'll finish on these MOUs. What kind of length of document are you looking at, guys? Does this turn out to be a 15-page document? Or Ken, what do some of your MOUs look like?
I've had a 1-page MOU in place with the church, and I've had 5 to 7-page MOUs. Yeah. There's not really any sort of legalese, right, in these documents. They're really rich, and they're full of, aspirational commitments. They're full of goals. They're full of priorities, and they do serve an important purpose. Okay. So
that's good. Chris, some of your MOUs with Sam or with other agencies, what kind of length are you looking at?
Yeah, the same, 2 to 3 pages at the most. This isn't the type of thing where we're writing, every single small little detail we can think of and then hiring a lawyer to look over it. We're really just, you're thinking about writing one of these things. It's just trying to figure out in writing who's responsible for what. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's just the simple answer. What is the church responsible for, and what's the sending organization responsible for? And then what are we both looking for from our missionary? And really just an MOU that covers those 3 things is all we really look for.
Great.
Yeah. Mags, you mentioned this earlier, how important it is to establish points of contact. Right. We'll actually do that in an MOU. We'll say, okay, this is your point of contact within SAM, and ask the church to say, state who our point of contact from the church is going to be. So again, this is a place to get that in writing.
Yeah. Excellent. We do the same, and it just clarifies who to call. Now, Pastor Chris, if any of our listeners wanted to learn more about this, are there any recommended resources you have in mind with regard to church-agency relation?
So there's an organization called the Upstream Collective. I think it's the upstreamcollective.org that a former colleague of mine has founded. You can get really good resources there, not only on building relationships with agencies, but also just broader, how do we build sending in our church? We at our website, summitchurch.com/missions, have put everything that we can think of that we've documented. We've put under the resource tab there. So one of our plumb lines here is to share our work and copy others. We want to make sure anything that we've done is on there. And then also, just for a book that I've found personally helpful, is A Vision of the Possible by Daniel Sinclair. Again, it's broader than just agency church relationships, but it touches on that as well.
Super. Ken, I'll look over your way. Are there any resources that you'd like to recommend to our audience?
Sure. One that I'll mention is actually an association or organization. It's called Missio Nexus. And Missio Nexus originally was, I think, primarily, an organization of mission organizations, but Missio Nexus has expanded its scope to include churches, for example. It's really an organization of missional leaders who are interested in accelerating the fulfillment of the Great Commission in partnership with the global church. They have annual meetings. They have, seminars at these meetings, learning tracks, and you can get a lot of exposure where, at these meetings, they'll unpack a lot of, I guarantee you there's tracks on what we're talking about today in this podcast at Missio Nexus meetings. So missionexus.org. And again, access to videos and books and other resources as well. But, churches who are interested in Great Commission ministry should absolutely be a part of Missio Nexus.
It's a great mention. There are other resources that these gentlemen have indicated, and we will include those in the show notes. There's a few articles, a few books, and again, we just continue to compile those things on the website. You can visit that at globalmissionspodcast.com. Last question, gentlemen. If our listeners would like to reach out to you, Pastor Chris, maybe there's another missions pastor or someone on a missions committee, and they would like to talk with you. How could they follow up with you?
Yeah, just email me missions@summitrdu.com. So I love to hear from people in the church that just want to know more and collaborate more. Really, genuinely is one of my favorite parts of the job, is just to be able to brainstorm with other lay people or other pastors how to send faithfully and send better.
Very good. Thank you. And Ken, if our listeners would like to follow up with you as an agency guy, who, by the way, is multi-agency minded, Sam in general and Ken in specific are glad to talk about other agencies nicely. If he can be helpful from the agency point of view, how could they reach out to you?
Yeah, be careful what you say, Max. You never know what I'm going to say. But emails, of course, my email address is ken.massey@samlink.org. But then, you know what? You're welcome to call my office too, 803-802-8580. I'm happy to speak with you. So if you call, just mention that you heard me on the Global Missions podcast, and I'll be sure to pick up the phone if you say that.
Super. Well, gentlemen, I'm a little sad to bring this one to a close because it's been very rich and there are more ideas we could talk about. We've just scratched the surface. But I want to say thank you on behalf of our listeners to each of you, both of you, for participating today and for stimulating our thinking and for sharing some great resources along this line. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Ken. Lord bless you both. Well, I both enjoyed and learned a lot during this conversation with Chris and Ken. Some excellent suggestions about how churches and agencies can really work well together, build a relationship of trust and clarity. And we hope whether you're on a missions committee or you're a pastor or maybe you're part of an agency, maybe there are steps you can take to strengthen that partner relationship between the sending body and the serving agency. Remember, you can find the show notes for this episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, including the list of resources that Chris and Ken mentioned. This episode has been brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.